Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For empaths, this darkness isn't evil. It's their suppressed anger, their denied needs, their silenced voice. And when they finally meet this shadow, everything shifts. Because the empath who meets their shadow doesn't suddenly turn cold, they turn clear. And when the shadow finally surfaces, it doesn't come as a tantrum, it comes as a boundary, a nervous system that finally stops negotiating with disrespect. It's sovereignty. It's the moment you realize your sensitivity was never meant to be a leash. It was meant to be a gift, protected, not exploited, a gift with a lock on the door. So if you've been feeling that quiet shift lately, the one where you're not exploding, you're just done, stay with me. Because we're about to talk about the exact chain reaction Jung described when an empath withdraws their projections, and why the silence that follows is the most powerful no you've ever spoken. Empaths don't just care about how people feel, they carry how people feel. You can watch it happen in real time. An empath walks into a room and their shoulders change before anyone says hello. They notice the small things first, the clipped tone, the too loud laugh, the way someone avoids eye contact like it's dangerous. And without meaning to, they start doing what they've always done, adjusting themselves to keep the atmosphere from collapsing. Jung noticed this pattern in his most sensitive patients. He saw it as an adaptation, a nervous system that learned early. If I can predict the storm, I can survive the storm. That's why so many empaths feel responsible for moods that aren't theirs. Not because they're dramatic, not because they're too much, because at some point being aware became a form of safety. If you grew up around emotional volatility, someone unpredictable, someone cold, someone who made love conditional, your body learned to scan for danger like it was a job, so you became the emotional shock absorber. In family systems, you don't just show up. You can feel when mom is spiraling before she admits it. You can hear the edge in dad's silence. You sense the exact moment a sibling is about to blow up the entire evening, and you intervene. Not because you want control, but because you want peace. But notice what that costs you. You're not relaxing at the table, you're working. You're reading micro-signals, translating tension. And the worst part is you don't even call it labor, because you were trained to call it being good. That training usually starts young. People tell you you're so mature, when what they really mean is you learn to disappear, you learn to swallow your needs so other people wouldn't fall apart. And slowly, a dangerous identity forms. You're the one who understands, the one who forgives, the one who can take it. Until one day you realize you've been paying for connection with your nervous system. Jung would call this a persona, the nice one, the helpful one, the strong one. A mask that keeps you accepted, a mask that also keeps you trapped. Because when your worth comes from being the emotional support system, you start believing that rest is selfish and boundaries are betrayal. And that's the setup, because an empath can play the shock absorber for years, decades even, but nothing built to absorb endless impact stays intact forever. Eventually, something inside you stops cushioning the blow. And that's where the real story begins. Most empaths think they're forgiving, they think they're letting it go. But Jung noticed something that changes everything. Even when your conscious mind keeps making excuses, your unconscious is still recording the truth. Quietly, precisely, without mercy, because your unconscious doesn't care about your story. It cares about patterns. It remembers the tone your mother uses right before she turns your boundaries into an insult. It remembers how your partner gets sweet when they've done something wrong. How a friend disappears when you need support, then returns the moment they're in crisis again. You may call that overthinking. Your unconscious calls it data. And this is why empaths are so terrifying when they finally wake up. Not because they suddenly become cold, but because they realize they've known for a long time. Jung saw highly sensitive people develop something like an internal map of everyone around them, so you become fluent in other people's strategies. You know the exact moment someone shifts from honest to performative. You can tell when an apology is real or when it's just a reset button so the cycle can start again. You recognize the difference between I miss you and I miss what you do for me. But here's the painful part. Even with all that awareness, most empaths don't act on it. They override it. They tell themselves, maybe I'm being too sensitive. They tell themselves, everyone has flaws, and the unconscious just keeps taking notes. It's cataloging every time you ignored your gut, every time you stayed in a conversation that made you feel smaller, every time you explained yourself to someone who wasn't confused, just committed to misunderstanding you. Jung would call this a psychological split. On the surface, you're the calm one, the understanding one, the one who doesn't make a big deal. But underneath, pressure is building, not the kind of anger you express and release, the kind you swallow, the kind that turns inward and slowly poisons your self-respect. And that's why the breaking point doesn't come from something small. It comes from betrayal. Not because betrayal is new, but because it forces one brutal realization. I saw this coming, and I abandoned myself anyway. If you've ever felt that sick clarity where the truth hits you and you can't unsee it, comment, I knew. Because in the next chapter we're talking about what happens the moment your projections collapse and the empath stops protecting the illusion. Betrayal is never just what they did. For an empath, betrayal is what it reveals. It's the moment your nervous system goes ice cold, not because you're numb, but because your body finally stops negotiating with the truth. Jung watched this happen in sensitive people over and over. He noticed that the event itself, the affair, the lie, the backstabbing conversation you weren't supposed to hear, was rarely the deepest wound. The deepest wound was the realization underneath it. I knew, not in a dramatic, psychic way, in a quiet, everyday way. The way your stomach tightened when they said, trust me, the way you kept catching little inconsistencies and forcing yourself to laugh them off. Because as an empath, you don't just observe people, you project onto them. Jung called it projection when we unconsciously place our own inner qualities onto someone else. Empaths do this in a very specific way. You project depth onto shallow people. You project emotional maturity onto people who only speak the language of need. And it feels beautiful while it lasts, because it makes you believe you're safe. You tell yourself, they're not trying to hurt me, they're just wounded. You tell yourself, they mean well, they just don't know how to love. But betrayal is the moment the projection can't hold its shape anymore. It collapses. And when it collapses, you don't just lose trust in them. You lose the version of reality you built to survive. You lose the fantasy that your love could override someone else's character. You lose the hope that if you keep being good, people will finally become good back. This is why betrayal hits empaths like a spiritual concussion. It snaps you out of a trance. Suddenly you remember the things you excused, the moments you minimized, the disrespect you swallowed because you didn't want to be difficult. And a painful clarity rises up. You weren't blind. You were loyal to an illusion. Jung described this as the withdrawal of projections. The psyche pulls back the energy it had been pouring into the wrong image. And that withdrawal feels like a death, because it is. It's the death of the persona that kept you connected, the understanding one, the I don't need much one, the one who absorbs pain and calls it love. This is also where something else emerges, something society didn't prepare you for, not chaos, not revenge, a strange calm. Your tears stop midstream, your chest goes quiet, and your mind becomes terrifyingly clear. You look at the person who betrayed you and you don't even feel hatred. Hatred still requires attachment. Hatred still needs them to matter. What you feel is something colder and cleaner. I see you. And for the first time, you include yourself in the seeing. You see how many times you overrode your body, how often you talked yourself out of your own boundaries, how often you called your intuition anxiety because admitting the truth would have forced you to change. This is why betrayal becomes the catalyst, not because it destroys you, because it ends the self-betrayal. If you've ever had that moment where the truth hit and something inside you went silent, write this: the illusion died. Because in the next chapter, we're talking about what happens when an empath stops explaining, stops negotiating, and stops participating in the emotional games that used to control them. Anger is familiar. Anger is something people know how to manage. They can apologize just enough to soften it. They can flip the script and make you feel guilty for having it. Because they've seen this version of you before, the version that gets upset, then forgives, then goes right back to carrying everything. But Jung noticed a shift that's far more unsettling than anger. The day the empath goes quiet, not silent as punishment, silent as clarity. It's the moment you stop performing emotional labor, you stop rushing to fix what you didn't break. And what makes it terrifying to other people is you don't announce it, you simply don't show up the same way anymore. And this is where the game starts collapsing. Because a lot of dysfunctional systems survive on one thing: your predictable reaction, your guilt, your urgency, your instinct to rescue. When you remove that, people feel like the floor is missing. They try to recreate the old reality, but you don't. And Jung would say this is where the shadow begins to integrate. The part of you that was always there, the part that knows how to protect you, finally gets a voice. Not a loud voice, a clean one. You start saying things like, "That doesn't work for me." You stop explaining your worth to people who only valued your usefulness. To them, this feels like punishment. To you, it feels like oxygen. And here's the twist: you haven't stopped caring about people. You've stopped caring about the illusion that your overgiving is love. So the quiet becomes a line in the sand, not made out of rage, made out of self-respect. For most empaths, the word selfish feels like a threat, not because you're incapable of putting yourself first, but because you were trained to believe that putting yourself first makes you unlovable. Somewhere along the way, you learned that love had to be earned through sacrifice, that being good meant being available, that having needs meant being difficult. So when Jung talked about the shadow, empaths didn't hear wholeness. They heard danger, because the shadow is everything you were taught to suppress. The part of you that wants space, the part that can watch someone suffer the consequences of their choices without collapsing into guilt. And society labels that part as cold, but Jung saw it differently. He understood the shadow isn't evil, it's excluded life. It's the energy you had to bury to survive the role you were assigned. For many empaths, especially women, this role starts early. So the shadow grows in the basement of your psyche, not as hatred, as self-protection you weren't allowed to use. That's why the awakening feels so shocking. Because when you finally stop caring the way you used to, the nice persona cracks and the shadow steps forward. Not screaming, just standing there. And the first time you meet it, you might mistake it for cruelty. You might think, "Oh, what's wrong with me? Why don't I feel guilty?" You might even panic because you're not rushing to fix the situation anymore. But what's actually happening is integration. Jung would say you're reclaiming the parts of you that were sacrificed to keep others comfortable. You're taking back your survival instincts, your boundaries, your anger, the anger that says, this is not love, this is extraction. It's the part that refuses to be hurt for free. It's your psychological immune system. And once it integrates, your empathy changes shape. You still feel deeply, you still perceive what others miss, but you stop confusing compassion with self-erasure. You stop offering unlimited access to your nervous system. To outsiders, it looks like you got selfish, but Jung would call it individuation, the birth of psychological sovereignty, the moment you become a whole person instead of a service. And here's the most uncomfortable truth. Some people only loved the version of you that had no immune system. They loved the you that could be guilted, the you that could be pressured, the you that would always show up no matter how you were treated. So when your shadow integrates, their access ends. Not because you hate them, because you finally respect yourself. People don't panic when you stop caring because you became mean. They panic because you stopped being useful. For years, you weren't just a person in the room, the one who could sense the tension rising and quietly absorb it before it exploded. You did it so naturally that everyone forgot it was even happening. That's how dysfunctional systems survive. Not because they're healthy, but because someone like you keeps paying the emotional cost. When you stop showing up like that, the system loses its stabilizer. Suddenly people have to face each other without your buffering, and it feels unbearable. So they call you selfish. Not because you're actually selfish, because that word is their emergency lever. It's meant to pull you back into the role. If you feel guilty, you'll return. If you return, the system can keep running the same way. In friendships, the panic looks different. It's subtle at first. You stop responding right away. You don't jump on every crisis text like it's your responsibility. And the moment you stop feeding the pattern, the friendship reveals what it was built on. Some people don't miss you. They miss access to you. And when you don't take the bait anymore, other people are forced to carry what they've been dumping on you. That's when they get irritated. They start acting confused. They say things like, "You've changed," in that disappointed tone that's supposed to sting. But Jung would say something important here. When your persona starts dying, the nice one, the always available one, people who benefited from that mask will feel threatened. Not because you're hurting them, but because you're no longer participating in the illusion. Your absence exposes what you used to cover. The drama doesn't disappear. It just stops having a sponge. So yes, people panic, they escalate, they guilt trip, they try to provoke the old version of you because the old version was predictable, but the awakened empath isn't predictable anymore. You're conscious. Selective empathy is what happens when you stop confusing sensitivity with obligation. Jung would say this is the final stage of awakening for the empath, not because you're finished growing, but because you've crossed a line you can't uncross. You've learned the difference between feeling someone's pain and becoming responsible for it. Before this stage, your empathy ran on autopilot, but now something is different. You can still read the room, but the room doesn't get to read you like an open book. You can still sense manipulation, but you don't argue with it. You can still feel someone's sadness, but you don't take it home and make it your problem. Because once your shadow integrates, empathy becomes a choice instead of a reflex. You start directing your compassion the way a healthy person directs their money, with intention. You don't hand it to anyone who demands it. You invest it where there's reciprocity. And that's why your energy feels different now. You're not available to be guilted. You're not available to be pulled into manufactured emergencies. When someone tries to bait you into the old dance, you don't perform. You pause. You observe. And if it's not real, you don't engage. This is where your intuition becomes razor sharp. Not because you gained some superpower, but because you stopped drowning it out. You're no longer clouded by the desperate hope that people will become what you need them to be. You see what's there, you respond accordingly. Sometimes the response is compassion, sometimes it's distance. And here's the part that looks heartless to outsiders. You can walk away without needing closure, not because you don't feel anything, because you finally trust what you already know. Jung called this differentiated consciousness, the ability to stay centered while connecting. You can help without disappearing. You can care without betraying yourself. If you've reached the point where you can read people clearly but you no longer crave their approval, write this: I see you, and I choose me. This is what the new life looks like when an empath stops rescuing and starts choosing. It's quieter than you expected, not lonely in a tragic way, quiet in a clean way. Like your nervous system finally got permission to exhale. Your home stops feeling like an emergency room. Your phone stops feeling like a panic button. Your time stops being something other people can claim just because they want it. And the biggest shift is this: you don't give automatically anymore. You give when it's real. You start asking different questions. Not, how do I keep them happy? But, do I feel safe being myself here? Not, will they leave if I set a boundary? But why would I stay if I can't? Jung would call this conscious participation. You re-enter relationships from choice, not compulsion. You help from overflow, not from guilt. Some connections deepen because they were always genuine. Others fall away because they were built on your self-erasure. And you don't chase what leaves because you finally understand. Anything that requires you to abandon yourself was never love. It was a contract, and you're done signing it. Here's what I want you to take with you. The empath who stops caring didn't lose their heart. They stopped renting it out for free. You didn't stop loving people. You stopped abandoning yourself just to keep the peace. Because real love doesn't require you to disappear. Real kindness doesn't demand self-erasure. And real connection doesn't come with a price tag that reads, your nervous system. If you've been grieving the old version of you, the one who always answered, always forgave, always tried harder, understand this: that version wasn't you. It was a survival strategy, a persona built to stay safe, stay needed, stay accepted. And Jung's final stage was never about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It's about taking back the parts of you that were labeled too much or too selfish or too sensitive, and realizing those parts were never your flaw. They were your protection, your truth, your immune system. When you integrate your shadow, you become love with boundaries. You become kindness that doesn't come at the cost of your soul. Your peace is non-negotiable, and anyone who can't respect that doesn't get access to you.